The late September rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Meridian Tech's downtown Seattle office, creating rivulets that distorted the view of the Space Needle in the distance. Marcus Chen stood at the head of the conference room, his arms crossed over his crisp white Oxford shirt, watching as the IT department filed in for their Monday morning meeting. The air conditioning hummed steadily, fighting against the humidity that had seeped in through the building's ventilation. System. "All right, people, let's make this quick," Marcus announced, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who'd spent 8 years climbing the corporate ladder. At 34, he was the youngest senior systems architect Meridian Tech had ever appointed, and he wore that achievement like armor. "We've got the Barrington financial migration coming up in 6 weeks, and we're already behind schedule." The team settled into their chairs, a mix of seasoned developers, network specialists, and support staff who'd become accustomed to Marcus's no-nonsense approach. Coffee cups clinked against the mahogany table, and the scent of fresh brew from the break room mingled with the ozone smell that always seemed to linger in tech offices. "Before we dive into the status updates," interrupted Janet Holloway, the HR director, who'd slipped in through the side door, "I'd like to introduce our newest team member." She gestured toward a young woman who'd been standing quietly near the back of the room, almost invisible in her oversized navy cardigan and simple black slacks. The woman stepped forward, her movements careful and measured. She couldn't have been more than 23 or 24, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and glasses that seemed slightly too large for her narrow face. Her brown eyes scanned the room with a mixture of nervousness and determination. "Everyone, this is Emily Rodriguez," Janet continued with practiced cheerfulness. "She'll be joining us as a junior systems analyst. Emily just graduated from the University of Washington with a degree in computer science and information systems. She comes highly recommended from Professor Blackwell's program." Marcus felt his jaw tighten slightly. Another fresh graduate with theoretical knowledge and zero real-world experience. Just what they needed when they were already drowning in critical projects. He forced a professional smile and extended his hand. "Welcome to Meridian, Emily," he said, his handshake firm and brief. "Hope you're ready to hit the ground running. We don't have much time for hand-holding around here." Emily's handshake was surprisingly strong, though her voice remained soft. "Thank you, Mr. Chen. I'm ready to contribute however I can." "It's Marcus," he corrected, already turning back to the presentation screen. "Mr. Chen is my father. Janet, thanks for the introduction. Emily, grab a seat anywhere. We're just going through the migration timeline." As the meeting progressed, Marcus outlined the challenges they were facing. Barrington Financial was one of their biggest clients, a wealth management firm with over 200 offices across the Pacific Northwest. They were migrating from a legacy system that had been cobbled together over 15 years to Meridian's cutting-edge cloud-based platform. The problem was that the old system was a nightmare of custom modifications, undocumented workarounds, and data inconsistencies. "The integration testing keeps failing on the transaction reconciliation module," reported Derek Santos, their lead developer, a stocky man in his 40s with graying temples and perpetual 5 o'clock shadow. "We're getting corruption errors on about 12% of the historical data transfers. I've had my team working overtime, but we can't seem to nail down the pattern." Marcus felt the familiar tension building in his shoulders. This was the 3rd week in a row Derek had reported the same issue. "What about the error logs? Have you traced the source?" "We've analyzed thousands of entries," Derek replied, frustration evident in his voice. "The corruptions seem random. Sometimes it's client addresses, sometimes account balances, sometimes transaction dates. There's no consistency. It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack the size of Texas." "Random means we're missing something," Marcus insisted, his fingers drumming against the table. "Systems don't just randomly fail. There's always a pattern, always a root cause. We need to dig deeper." From the back of the room, Emily shifted in her seat, and Marcus caught the movement in his peripheral vision. She looked like she wanted to say something but thought better of it. Good. At least she understood the hierarchy here. The last thing they needed was a newbie offering half-baked solutions to complex problems she couldn't possibly understand yet. The meeting dragged on for another 45 minutes, covering server capacity issues, security protocol updates, and staffing concerns. By the time they wrapped up, Marcus's patience was wearing thin, and the rain outside had intensified, creating a steady drumbeat against the windows that matched his growing headache. As the team filed out, Marcus grabbed his coffee, now cold, and headed to his office, a corner space with a view of Elliott Bay when the weather wasn't terrible. His desk was cluttered with printouts of error logs, system, diagrams, and sticky notes covered in his own hasty scrawl. The walls were decorated with his diplomas from Stanford and MIT, along with several industry awards that Meridian had won under his leadership. He'd barely sat down when there was a tentative knock on his doorframe. Emily stood there, her hands clasped in front of her, looking every bit the nervous newcomer. "Marcus, do you have a minute?" He glanced at his watch. 10:47 a.m. He had a call with Barrington's CTO at 11. "About 30 seconds. What do you need?" "I was just wondering if you could point me toward any documentation on the Barrington project," she said, stepping just inside the doorway. "I'd like to familiarize myself with the system architecture and the migration scope." Marcus pulled up a file directory on his secondary monitor and quickly sent her a link. "Everything's in the shared drive. Architecture specs, data mappings, test results. It's all there. Fair warning, though, it's about 6,000 pages of documentation, most of it written by people who've since left the company." "That's fine," Emily replied, a hint of determination crossing her features. "I'm a fast reader." "Listen, Emily," Marcus said, softening his tone slightly. He didn't want to crush her enthusiasm completely, even if it was misplaced. "I appreciate the initiative, but this project is way beyond entry-level work. You'll be most helpful if you focus on the basics for now. User acceptance testing, maybe some documentation. Updates, leave the heavy lifting to the people who've been here a while." Something flickered in her eyes. Was it disappointment? Frustration? But she simply nodded. "Understood. Thanks for the access." After she left, Marcus turned his attention to preparing for the call with Barrington. Richard Lawson, their CTO, was not a patient man, and he'd been asking increasingly pointed questions about the migration timeline. Marcus pulled up the latest status report, his eyes scanning the sea of yellow, and read status indicators. Nothing was on track. The reconciliation errors were the biggest issue, but they were also experiencing performance bottlenecks in the reporting module and integration problems with Barrington's third-party trading platforms. The call went about as well as expected. Lawson's face on the video conference looked pinched and irritated, his expensive suit doing little to hide the stress he was under. "Marcus, I'm going to be straight with you," Lawson said, his Boston accent thickening as his frustration grew. "My board is breathing down my neck. We've already delayed this migration twice. We've got regulatory audits coming up, and we need this new system operational. If you can't deliver, I need to know now so we can explore other options." "Richard, I understand the pressure you're under," Marcus replied, keeping his voice steady and confident even as his mind raced. "We've identified the issues, and my team is working around the clock. We'll have solutions in place within 2 weeks. 2 weeks, Lawson repeated flatly. "That's what you said 2 weeks ago. This time is different. We've narrowed down the scope of the problem. It's just a matter of executing the fixes." After the call ended, Marcus slumped back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. He wasn't lying exactly. They had narrowed down some aspects of the problem, but the truth was, they were still shooting in the dark with the reconciliation errors, and if they couldn't solve that, the entire migration would fail, taking Meridian's reputation and probably Marcus's career with it. The rest of the day passed in a blur of troubleshooting sessions, code reviews, and increasingly desperate brainstorming meetings. By 6 o'clock, most of the team had gone home, but the core group working on Barrington remained, hunched over their workstations in the dimly lit office. Derek had ordered pizza, their third dinner at the office that week. Marcus was reviewing a particularly dense section of error logs when he noticed Emily was still at her desk in the open workspace area. She'd positioned herself in a corner cubicle, her screen filled with what looked like system diagrams and data flow charts. She'd been there for hours, barely moving except to occasionally jot notes in a spiral notebook. He walked over, coffee cup in hand. "You know you don't have to stay late on your first day, right? Nobody expects that." Emily looked up, and he noticed the dark circles already forming under her eyes. But there was an intensity in her expression that caught him off guard. "I'm just trying to understand the data structure," she said. "The documentation is extensive." "That's one word for it," Marcus replied with a tired smile. "Byzantine nightmare is another." He glanced at her screen and frowned. "What are you looking at there?" "I was tracing the data lineage for the transaction records," Emily explained, pointing to a complex diagram she'd created. "Trying to understand how information flows from the legacy system through the transformation layers into the new platform. The documentation shows the current state. But I was curious about how the legacy system evolved over time, so I've been cross-referencing old change logs and system update records." Marcus felt a flicker of surprise. That was actually smart thinking, more sophisticated than he'd expected from a new graduate. "Find anything interesting?" "Maybe," she said cautiously. "I noticed that about 7 years ago, they implemented a patch to handle a Y2K-related issue in the date formatting. And then, about 4 years ago, there was another modification to accommodate a merger with another firm. Both changes involved the transaction timestamp fields, but they used slightly different encoding standards." "And?" Marcus prompted, his interest genuinely piqued now. "I'm not sure yet. I need to do more analysis. But if there's some kind of encoding conflict buried in the historical data, that could potentially cause the kind of intermittent corruption you're seeing, especially if the conversion process isn't accounting for these legacy format variations." Marcus considered this for a moment. It was a reasonable hypothesis, actually, but they'd already examined the date field conversions extensively. "We've tested the timestamp transformations pretty thoroughly, Emily. I don't think that's where the problem is." "You're probably right," she conceded quickly, her confidence evaporating. "Like I said, I'm just trying to learn the system." "Well, don't stay too late," Marcus said, moving toward his office. "First days are always overwhelming. It gets easier." But as he settled back at his desk, Emily's observation nagged at him. They had tested the date conversions, but had they specifically looked at records that had been modified multiple times across different system versions? He made a mental note to have Derek's team run some additional queries in the morning. By 8:30, the office was finally quiet. Marcus packed up his laptop and headed for the elevator, his mind already churning through tomorrow's priorities. As he waited for the elevator, he glanced back and saw that Emily's desk lamp was still on. Through the glass wall, he could see her still hunched over her keyboard, fingers flying, completely absorbed in whatever she was working on. He shook his head slightly. Enthusiasm was good, but she'd burn out in a week at this rate. The elevator dinged, and he stepped inside, leaving the glow of the office behind him. The drive home to his Belltown apartment took 30 minutes in the evening traffic, rain still falling steadily. Marcus's mind wouldn't let go of the Barrington problem. Every possible solution they'd tried had hit a dead end. The corruptions were too scattered, too unpredictable. It was like the data itself was fighting against them. His apartment was a bachelor's showcase, modern furniture, expensive electronics, walls decorated with abstract art he'd bought because the interior designer said it looked sophisticated. It was comfortable, professional, empty. He heated up leftover Thai food and ate while reviewing emails on his tablet, the local news playing unwatched on the television. Around 10, he got a text from Derek, running another batch of tests tonight. We'll have results by morning. This has to work. Marcus typed back, good, let me know if you need anything. But as he lay in bed later, staring at the ceiling and listening to the rain, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something fundamental, something obvious that was hiding in plain sight. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he kept seeing Emily's diagram, her careful notes, her observation about the legacy modifications. It was probably nothing. Fresh eyes often saw patterns that didn't actually exist, connections that were just coincidence. Still, as sleep finally claimed him, his last conscious thought was a question. What if she was onto something? The Seattle morning arrived grey and drizzly, typical for early October. Marcus made it to the office by 7:30, stopping at the Starbucks on the first floor for his usual grande Americano. The elevator was empty, except for him and one of the building's security guards, a friendly older man named Tom, who'd worked there longer than Meridian had occupied the space. "Working another long one, Mr. Chen?" Tom asked with a knowing smile. "Aren't I?" "Always," Marcus replied, managing a tired grin. When the elevator doors opened on the 14th floor, Marcus was surprised to find lights already on in the main workspace. He walked through the maze of cubicles and stopped short when he saw Emily at her desk, surrounded by an impressive collection of empty energy drink cans and what looked like a full night's worth of printouts and handwritten notes. She was wearing the same clothes from yesterday. "Emily!" Marcus set his coffee down on the cubicle wall. Did you stay here all night?" She jumped slightly, clearly startled, and spun in her chair to face him. Her eyes were bloodshot, and her hair had escaped its ponytail in several places, but there was an unmistakable excitement in her expression. "I think I found it," she said, her words tumbling out quickly. "The pattern, I'm not completely sure, but the data strongly suggests—" "Whoa! Slow down," Marcus interrupted, holding up a hand. "First question, did you actually sleep here?" Emily had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "I went home around 9, but then I had an idea and came back around midnight. I know it probably seems excessive for a first week, but I really think I found something important." Marcus felt conflicting emotions: concern for this clearly exhausted young woman, annoyance that she'd ignored his advice about not burning out, and despite himself, curiosity about what she'd discovered. "Emily, you can't just work through the night. That's not sustainable, and frankly, the company has liability issues with—" "Marcus, please, just look at this," she interrupted, gesturing to her monitor with an urgency that gave him pause. 5 minutes. If I'm wrong, I promise I'll go home and sleep for 12 hours. He sighed and pulled up a chair. 5 minutes, but after this, you're taking the rest of the day off, whether you found something or not. Emily nodded eagerly and turned her monitor so they could both see it clearly. The screen showed a complex spreadsheet with multiple color-coded columns and what looked like thousands of rows of data. "Okay, so remember what I mentioned yesterday about the legacy system modifications?" she began, her fingers moving rapidly across the keyboard to highlight different sections. "I spent last night, this morning, pulling every transaction record that showed corruption errors in the test migrations, all 8,247 of them. That's a lot of records," Marcus observed, leaning forward despite himself. "Right, but here's the thing. When I cross-referenced the corrupted records with the system modification logs, I found that 94% of the corrupted transactions were originally entered during 3 specific time windows." She pulled up a timeline chart. July 2014 to September 2014, January 2017 to March 2017, and November 2019 to February 2020. Marcus frowned, studying the chart. "Those dates correspond to major system updates," Emily finished. The 2014 window was when Barrington acquired Westfield Capital and had to merge their databases. The 2017 window was when they upgraded their core banking platform, and 2019 was the implementation of new regulatory compliance features. "We knew about those upgrades," Marcus said slowly. "We accounted for them in the data mapping." "You accounted for the final state of each upgrade," Emily countered, pulling up another document. "But look at this. I found internal memos buried in the documentation archive. During each of these upgrades, there were transition periods where the system was running in a hybrid mode, some processes using the new format, some still using the old. And during those transition periods, the transaction records were being stamped with inconsistent metadata tags." She highlighted a section of code from the legacy system. "See this? The transaction validation routine checks for a specific metadata flag to determine which parsing rules to apply. But during the hybrid periods, some records got flagged incorrectly. The system didn't catch it because the transactions themselves were valid. It was just the metadata that was wrong. And that bad metadata has been sitting in the database ever since, invisible. Until now, when we're trying to migrate everything to a new system that expects consistent formatting." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. This actually made sense. If the metadata is corrupted, then the conversion scripts would be applying the wrong transformation rules to those records. "Exactly!" Emily's exhaustion seemed to evaporate in her excitement. "And because the corruption is in the metadata, not the actual transaction data, it wouldn't show up in standard data quality checks. But when the migration process tries to convert everything, it's using the metadata to determine how to parse each record. So records with bad metadata get parsed incorrectly, leading to corruption in the migrated data." Marcus stood up and began pacing, his mind racing through the implications. But if this is the pattern, why is the corruption still appearing random? Why doesn't it affect all records from those time periods? "Because it only affects records that were modified during the hybrid transition windows," Emily explained, pulling up yet another spreadsheet. "Look, I mapped it out. If a transaction was entered and never touched again during a transition period, it's fine. If it was entered before and modified during, or entered during and modified after, that's when the metadata corruption occurs. And Barrington's system had a lot of modifications happening constantly. Balance adjustments, address updates, error corrections. So the affected records are scattered throughout the database based on when specific accounts had activity during these critical windows." Marcus stopped pacing and looked at her with genuine respect. Emily, this is exactly the kind of pattern we've been trying to find for 3 months. How did you—" "I got lucky," she said modestly, though she couldn't quite hide her pride. "I was just looking at the data from a different angle. Fresh eyes, I guess." "No," Marcus said firmly. "Luck is finding something by accident. This was systematic analysis. You traced the data lineage, identified temporal correlations, and formulated a testable hypothesis. That's not luck. That's good detective work." He pulled out his phone and started typing a message to Derek. "I'm calling an emergency team meeting for 9 o'clock. You need to present this to everyone." Emily's eyes widened. "Me? Present? I've been here 2 days. Shouldn't you—" "You found it. You present it," Marcus said. "That's how we do things here. But first, seriously, go splash some water on your face and get some more coffee. You look like you're about to fall over." As Emily headed to the restroom, Marcus felt a strange mix of emotions. There was relief. If her hypothesis was correct, they, finally, had a path to solving the Barrington disaster. There was excitement at the prospect of cracking a problem that had stumped his entire team. But there was also something else, something that felt uncomfortably like embarrassment. He'd dismissed her yesterday, told her to stick to basics, to leave the heavy lifting to the experienced people, and she'd gone ahead and potentially solved their biggest problem, while he and his veteran team had been spinning their wheels. By 9 o'clock, the E-Book conference room was full. Derek was there looking haggard from his own late night, along with the core Barrington team, Jennifer Wu from Data Architecture, Paul Martinez from Quality Assurance, and Lisa Chen, no relation to Marcus, from Client Services. They all looked curious about why Marcus had called an urgent meeting. "Thanks for coming in on short notice," Marcus began, standing at the front of the room. "I know we're all exhausted and frustrated with the Barrington situation, but I think we might have a breakthrough. Emily, you want to walk everyone through what you found?" Emily stood up, noticeably nervous, clutching a small remote for the presentation screen. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled up her first slide. "Good morning, everyone. So, I've only been here a couple days, and I know I'm the newest person on this team, but I spent last night analyzing the corruption patterns, and I think I might have identified the root cause." For the next 20 minutes, Emily walked through her findings. At first, the team looked skeptical. Marcus could see it in their body language, the subtle eye rolls when she mentioned spending all night on it, the crossed arms suggesting they'd heard plenty of theories already. But as she presented her data, showing the correlation between corruption rates and the historical system modifications, the room's energy shifted. Derek was the first to really engage. "Wait, go back to that slide about the metadata flags. Are you saying the validation routine was checking against the wrong schema during the transitions?" "Not exactly wrong," Emily clarified, clicking back to the relevant slide. "The schema was transitioning, so some records were being validated against schema version A, some against version B, and some were getting mixed validation because they had attributes from both versions, and that mixed validation created inconsistent metadata tags." "I'll be damned," Jennifer breathed, leaning forward to study the data more closely. "We tested the schema conversions, but we tested them in isolation. We never looked at how the system behaved during the actual transition periods when both versions were active." Paul was already pulling up the error logs on his laptop. "If this is right, we should be able to filter the corrupted records based on their modification dates and metadata signatures. Let me run a query." "I already did," Emily said, pulling up another slide. "Based on the pattern, I identified approximately 8,000 high-probability corrupted records. That's about 96% of our known errors, with a margin for false positives." The room fell silent as everyone stared at the data on the screen. Marcus watched his team's faces as understanding dawned. This wasn't just a theory, this was a solution. Lisa broke the silence. "If we can identify and flag these records before migration, we can apply corrective transformations to fix the metadata before the conversion process even touches them." "Exactly," Emily agreed. "I drafted a rough correction script. It would need refinement and extensive testing, but in theory it should standardize the metadata based on the actual transaction content rather than relying on the corrupted flags." Derek was already on his feet, moving toward the door. "I need to get my team on this immediately. If we can validate this pattern against our test environment—" He paused at the doorway and looked back at Emily. "This is brilliant work. Seriously." The meeting dissolved into excited technical discussions, people pulling out laptops and starting to model solutions based on Emily's findings. Marcus stood back and watched, a small smile on his face despite the lingering tightness in his chest. He caught up with Emily as people were filing out. "You should head home now, get some real sleep. We'll take it from here." "Are you sure?" Emily asked, though her exhaustion was clearly catching up with her. "I could help with the validation testing. I'm sure. You've done more than enough." He paused, then added, "Actually, you've done more than anyone else on this team, including me. So go home, rest, and come back tomorrow, ready to help us implement this fix." After she left, Marcus returned to his office, but he couldn't focus on his usual tasks. He kept thinking about how close they'd come to disaster. How many more weeks would they have wasted if Emily hadn't dug into those archives? How many sleepless nights for? The whole team. How much stress, how much risk to the company, and he'd told her to step aside, to stick to the basics, to leave the real work to the experienced people. His phone buzzed with a text from Derek. Running validation tests, preliminary results confirming Emily's pattern. "This is going to work," Marcus typed back. "Good, keep me posted." But as he set down his phone, he found himself pulling up Emily's personnel file. Her resume showed a 3.9 GPA from UW, multiple academic awards, a senior thesis on legacy system integration challenges that had won a departmental prize. Her recommendation letters from Professor Blackwell and 2 others were glowing, describing her as exceptionally analytical and remarkably persistent. All of this had been in her file when HR sent it to him 2 weeks ago. He'd barely glanced at it. Fresh graduate, no experience, probably need lots of hand-holding. That had been his assessment. He hadn't even bothered to read her thesis title. He closed the file and leaned back in his chair, staring at the rain-streaked windows. The truth was starting to settle in, uncomfortable and undeniable. He'd underestimated her. Not because she'd done anything wrong, not because she'd given him any reason to doubt her capabilities. He'd underestimated her because she was young, because she was new, because she didn't fit his mental image of what someone who could solve complex problems looked like. She'd said, "Step aside," yesterday when he'd dismissed her input. No, wait. He'd said that. Or had he? The exact words were fuzzy now, but the sentiment was clear. He'd essentially told her to step aside and let the grown-ups work. And then she'd solved what they'd missed for months. The next day, Emily returned, looking refreshed, though still a bit sheepish about her all-nighter. The office was buzzing with energy that had been absent for weeks. Derek's team had validated her hypothesis. The pattern held up perfectly. They'd identified every corrupted record, and the correction script was working in the test environment. By the end of the week, they had a working solution. The Barrington migration timeline was back on track. Richard Lawson's next check-in call was practically cheerful compared to the previous one, and Marcus found himself watching Emily work with a mix of admiration and self-reflection that he wasn't entirely comfortable with. She'd proven herself beyond any doubt. But what did it say about him that he'd needed that? A proof. What did it say about his leadership? These were questions he didn't have easy answers to, but he was starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, he needed to examine some of his assumptions about who was worth listening to. October in Seattle brought shorter days and longer shadows across Meridian Tech's open plan office. The Barrington financial migration was progressing smoothly for the first time in months, thanks to Emily's discovery and the subsequent corrections implemented by the team. The energy in the IT department had shifted from desperate scrambling to cautious optimism. Marcus noticed the change in how people treated Emily. Where before she'd been the invisible newbie relegated to the corner cubicle, now developers were stopping by her desk to ask questions, to run theories past her, to get her take on thorny technical problems. She'd become, in the span of 2 weeks, an integral part of the team. What Marcus hadn't quite processed yet was how much he needed to change his own approach. It was a Wednesday afternoon when things came to a head. The team was gathered in the main conference room for a design review on a new project, a complete system overhaul for Pacific Northwest Medical Group, a network of 73 clinics and 4 hospitals. The contract was worth $12 million over 3 years, and the initial discovery phase had revealed that their legacy systems made Barrington's look elegant by comparison. Marcus was leading the meeting, walking through the proposed architecture on the large wall-mounted screen. "So we'll implement a microservices approach here," he explained, pointing to a section of the diagram. "Patient data will be centralized in the cloud, with individual services handling appointments, billing, prescriptions, and medical records. Each clinic can access what they need through a unified API gateway." Emily, sitting near the middle of the table, raised her hand tentatively. Marcus nodded at her to speak. "I was just wondering," she began, her voice steady but careful. "Have we considered the latency issues with having all the patient data centralized? Some of these clinics are in pretty remote areas. I saw in the documentation that 3 of them are on the Olympic Peninsula, where internet reliability is questionable. If they lose connectivity, does that mean they can't access patient records at all?" Marcus felt a flash of irritation. "That's why we're building in offline caching. The local systems will maintain recent patient data locally." "Right, but how much data?" Emily pressed gently. "If a patient hasn't visited that particular clinic in 6 months, but they show up with an emergency, would their complete medical history be available in the offline cache? Or would the staff be working with incomplete information during an internet outage?" The room fell silent. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, then closed it. She had a point. They'd designed the caching layer to hold 30 days of data per location to minimize storage requirements. But in a medical emergency, at a remote clinic, during a storm that knocked out internet, which was not exactly uncommon on the peninsula, that 30-day window could be completely inadequate. That's a valid concern," Marcus admitted slowly, feeling the eyes of his team on him. "Derek, make a note. We need to rethink the caching strategy. Maybe implement a tiered system where critical medical data has longer retention. Or," Emily suggested hesitantly, "what if we had a hybrid approach? Critical data stays local and syncs, while less time-sensitive data like billing could be purely cloud-based." Jennifer Wu nodded enthusiastically. "That actually makes a lot of sense from a compliance perspective too. Medical data has different regulatory requirements than financial data. Keeping them in separate architectural domains could simplify our HIPAA implementation." Marcus felt that uncomfortable twinge again, the one that had been growing more frequent since Emily's Barrington breakthrough. Here was a fundamental flaw in their design that he'd missed, that his entire senior team had missed, and it had taken a junior analyst with 2 weeks of experience to spot it. "Good catch, Emily," he said, managing to keep his voice level and professional. "Let's table the current design and reconvene tomorrow with revised proposals that address these concerns." After the meeting, Marcus returned to his office and closed the door, something he rarely did. He sat at his desk, not looking at his computer, just thinking. His phone buzzed with messages from the team, but he ignored them for the moment. There was a pattern emerging, and he was finally being honest enough with himself to see it. Emily had solved the Barrington crisis. She'd identified the medical system's design flaw. She'd also, over the past 2 weeks, caught 3 security vulnerabilities in their code reviews that everyone else had missed, suggested a database indexing strategy that improved query performance by 40%, and written documentation that was clearer and more comprehensive than anything their technical writers had produced. She wasn't just competent, she was exceptional. And Marcus had spent 2 weeks telling himself it was beginner's luck, fresh perspective, the advantage of not being too close to the problems. He'd been making excuses instead of acknowledging what was obvious. She was simply better at this than he'd given her credit for. Better than he'd wanted to give her credit for, if he was being truly honest. Why was that so hard for him to accept? He thought back to his own early career. He'd graduated from Stanford with top honors, done a prestigious internship at Google, and still spent his first 2 years at Meridian fighting to be taken seriously. He'd been the young hotshot who had to prove himself with every project, every decision, every line of code. It had been exhausting and infuriating, and he'd promised himself that when he was the one in charge, he'd judge people on their capabilities, not their age or experience level. But somewhere along the way, he'd become the person he'd resented. He'd become the one who assumed youth meant incompetence, who confused years of experience with actual ability, who needed to be proven wrong before he'd listen. The realization sat heavy in his chest. There was a soft knock on his door. "Come in," he called. Emily entered, looking uncertain. "Do you have a minute? I wanted to apologize if I overstepped in the meeting. I know I'm still new and I didn't mean to—" "Stop," Marcus interrupted, surprising both of them with the sharpness of his tone. He softened it immediately. "Sorry. Please sit down." Emily sat, her hands folded in her lap, looking like she was preparing for a reprimand. "You didn't overstep," Marcus said carefully. "You did exactly what you should do. You saw a problem, and you spoke up. That's what good engineers do. That's what I expect from everyone on this team." "Okay," Emily said slowly, still looking wary. Marcus took a breath, then decided to just say it. "I owe you an apology, Emily. When you started here, I dismissed you. I assumed that because you were young and inexperienced, you wouldn't have much to contribute. I literally told you to step aside and let the veterans handle the complex work. And I was wrong, not just wrong. I was being a terrible leader." Emily's eyes widened. "I don't think—" "Please, let me finish," Marcus said. "The Barrington solution, that should have embarrassed me. My entire senior team, with decades of combined experience, and we couldn't see what you figured out in 2 days. And instead of being grateful and learning from it, I've spent the last 2 weeks trying to downplay your contributions in my own head, telling myself it was luck or fresh perspective or anything except the obvious truth. You're really good at this, and I should have recognized that from the beginning." Emily looked down at her hands, and Marcus wasn't sure if she was embarrassed or upset or both. When she looked up, her eyes were a bit watery, but her voice was steady. "Thank you for saying that," she said quietly. "Do you know how many times I've been told to step aside, in school, in internships, even in study groups? I'm used to having to prove myself 5 times over just to get taken as seriously as a mediocre guy with confidence. I'm used to being invisible until I do. Something undeniable, and then having people act surprised, like I'm some kind of anomaly." Her words hit harder than Marcus expected. He'd known, intellectually, that women in tech faced these challenges, but hearing it laid out so plainly by someone sitting in front of him, someone on his team, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "For what it's worth," he said, "you're not invisible anymore. Not to me, and not to this team. And I'm going to do better. I need to do better." Emily gave him a small smile. "I appreciate that, really. And for what it's worth, I understand why you were skeptical at first. I don't have the resume or experience that most people here have, but I work hard, and I love solving problems. That's all I've ever wanted, the chance to do the work and be judged on the results." "Then that's what you'll get," Marcus promised. "Actually, I want to propose something. We're putting together a task force to handle the Pacific Northwest Medical Project. It's going to be our biggest undertaking next year. I want you to be the lead systems analyst." Emily's eyes widened. "Lead? Marcus, I've been here less than a month, and you've already proven you can see things the rest of us miss. Look, I'm not saying you'll be in charge of the whole project. I'm still the senior architect. Derek's still the technical lead. But I want you driving the analysis, the requirements gathering, the design reviews. I trust your instincts, and clearly, I should have from the beginning." That's a big responsibility," Emily said, but he could see the excitement breaking through her uncertainty. "You can handle it, and you'll have support. But Emily, I need you to promise me something." "What?" "Don't hold back. If you see a problem, speak up. If you disagree with me, say so. If you think we're going down the wrong path, push back. I'm giving you this role, but more than that, I'm asking you to challenge us. Challenge me, because clearly we need it." Emily Shue nodded slowly, then with more confidence. "I can do that, thank you, Marcus. You have no idea what this means." After she left, Marcus felt something shift in his chest, the tightness that had been there for weeks finally beginning to ease. He pulled up his email and started drafting a message to the leadership team about Emily's new role. As he typed, he found himself thinking about all the other assumptions he'd been making, about his team, about himself, about what good leadership actually looked like. He had a lot to learn, but at least now he was willing to admit it. The next few weeks transformed the dynamic on the IT team. Emily stepped into her new role with a combination of enthusiasm and careful competence that impressed everyone. The Pacific Northwest Medical Project began with a comprehensive discovery phase, and Emily's approach was methodical and thorough. She spent days interviewing staff at different clinic locations, understanding their workflows, their pain points, their real-world needs. She sat with nurses during shift changes, observed how doctors interacted with the current systems, talked to billing specialists about the insurance claim process. Where Marcus would have relied primarily on documentation and stakeholder interviews, Emily immersed herself in the actual user experience. Her findings reshaped their entire approach to the project. The clinics don't need a unified system, she explained during a planning session in late October. They need an adaptable system. The urban clinics have completely different workflows than the rural ones. The specialty practices have different requirements than general family medicine. We've been designing one-size-fits-all, but that's going to create inefficiencies everywhere. So what are you suggesting? Marcus asked, genuinely curious. Modular design with configurable workflows, Emily proposed, pulling up a new architecture diagram she'd created. Core functionality that every location needs, patient records, scheduling, basic prescriptions that's standardized. But then we have optional modules that locations can enable based on their needs. Rural clinics get enhanced offline capabilities and simpler interfaces. Urban emergency departments get real-time integration with ambulance services and trauma protocols. Specialty practices get tailored modules for their specific needs. Orthopedics, pediatrics, cardiology, whatever. Derek whistled low. That's a lot more complex to build. Initially, yes, Emily acknowledged, but it's more maintainable long-term, and it actually serves the clients better. Plus, we can phase the rollout. Start with core functionality, add modules progressively, less risk, more flexibility. Marcus found himself nodding. It's good. It's really good. But it's going to require buy-in from Pacific Northwest Medical's leadership. They were expecting a more straightforward replacement of their current system. I can make the case to them, Emily offered. I've documented everything from my site visits. I have quotes from their staff, workflow diagrams, efficiency analyses. The data supports this approach. Then let's set up a presentation for their executive team, Marcus decided. You'll lead it. Emily's presentation to Pacific Northwest Medical 3 days later was masterful. She didn't just propose a solution, she told a story. She walked the executives through a day in the life of a rural clinic nurse, struggling with the current system, contrasted with the streamlined experience the new modular approach would provide. She showed them hard numbers on potential time savings, error reductions, and patient satisfaction improvements. By the end of her presentation, the medical group's CEO, Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, was leaning forward in her chair with undisguised enthusiasm. This is exactly what we need, Dr. Okonkwo said. Our current vendor kept trying to shoehorn us into their standard package, and it never quite fit. This modular approach, it actually respects that healthcare isn't one size fits all. After the meeting, as Marcus and Emily walked back to their office building through the Seattle drizzle, Marcus found himself seeing the city differently. The gray that usually felt oppressive now seemed contemplative. The rain that typically annoyed him felt cleansing. You did great in there, he told Emily, as they waited at a crosswalk. Thanks. I was terrified. Couldn't tell. You seemed completely inconfident. That's because I knew I was right, Emily said with a slight smile. The data was solid. The solution makes sense. Sometimes you just have to trust the work. Marcus thought about that as they entered the building and rode the elevator up to their floor. Trust the work. Trust the people doing the work. Trust that good ideas can come from anywhere, from anyone, regardless of how long they've been in their seat or how many credentials they have on the wall. It seemed like it should be obvious, but it had taken him months and a near disaster to really understand it. That evening, as the office emptied out, Marcus found himself working late again, but this time felt different. He wasn't scrambling to fix problems or frantically searching for solutions. He was planning, thoughtfully, carefully, with confidence in his team and their collective abilities. Emily was still at her desk too, but she was packing up for the day, having learned to maintain better work-life balance after her initial all-nighter. "Heading out?" Marcus called as she passed his office. "Yeah, got a date with my couch and whatever's on Netflix. You?" "Soon. Just wrapping up some planning for next quarter." Emily paused in his doorway. "Marcus, can I ask you something?" "Sure. What changed? I mean, I know you apologized and everything, but something really shifted in how you approach things. It's not just about me. You're different with the whole team." Marcus considered the question carefully. "I think I realized that being the smartest person in the room was never the goal. Building the smartest team, that's the goal, and that means actually listening to people, trusting them, giving them opportunities to show what they can do. It means being secure enough in my own abilities that I don't feel threatened when someone else has a better idea." "That's pretty evolved thinking," Emily observed. "Yeah, well, I had a good teacher," Marcus said with a slight smile. "Even if she had to hit me over the head with a solution to a 3-month-old problem before I'd pay attention," Emily laughed. "Glad I could help. See you tomorrow, Marcus." "See you tomorrow, Emily." As her footsteps faded down the hallway, Marcus turned back to his computer, but he couldn't focus on the planning documents. Instead, he found himself pulling up the team roster, looking at all the names, thinking about who else he might have underestimated, what other talents he might have overlooked. Tomorrow, he decided he'd start finding out. He'd start actually leading instead of just managing. He'd start building the team he should have been building all along. The rain continued to fall outside his window, washing the city clean, and Marcus felt something similar happening inside, old assumptions and biases being slowly, steadily washed away, leaving room for something better to grow. November brought an early cold snap to Seattle, and the first snow of the season dusted the peaks of the Cascade. Mountains visible from Meridian Tech's 14th floor windows. The Pacific Northwest Medical Project was in full swing. The Barrington financial migration was successfully completed, and the IT department had transformed from a stressed, struggling team into a cohesive unit, firing on all cylinders. Marcus stood in the executive conference room on the building's top floor, preparing for the quarterly leadership review. The room was all glass and steel, with panoramic views of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains beyond. His presentation was loaded, his notes were organized, and for the first time in months, he actually felt confident going into this meeting. Sarah Brennan, Meridian's CEO, entered first. A sharp woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and a reputation for cutting through nonsense. She was followed by the CFO, the COO, and the heads of the other major departments. "All right, Marcus," Sarah said, settling into her chair at the head of the long table. "Let's hear about Q4. Last time we talked, you were drowning in the Barrington crisis. Things better now?" "Much better," Marcus confirmed, pulling up his first slide. "I'll start with Barrington. As you know, we were facing significant challenges with data corruption during the migration process. Those challenges put the entire contract at risk and threatened our reputation with one of our largest clients." He clicked to the next slide, which showed a timeline of the crisis and its resolution. In September, we identified the root cause of the corruption, a metadata inconsistency in legacy records created during historical system transitions. We developed and implemented a correction protocol that allowed us to complete the migration with zero data loss and actually ahead of our revised deadline. Barrington Financial went live with the new system on October 15th, and we've had zero critical incidents since launch. That's impressive, the CFO noted, especially given how dire things looked in August. What changed? Marcus took a breath. This was the moment he'd been preparing for. We had a breakthrough from an unexpected source. One of our newest team members, Emily Rodriguez, who'd been with us less than a week at the time, identified the pattern that we'd been missing for months. She traced the data lineage back through multiple system generations and correlated the corruption with specific transition periods in the legacy system's evolution. Without her analysis, we'd likely still be struggling with the problem. Sarah raised an eyebrow. A new hire solved what your entire senior team couldn't? Yes, Marcus said simply. And that was a wake-up call for me about how I was leading the team. I'd made assumptions about who could contribute what, based on tenure and experience, rather than actual capability. I'd created an environment where junior team members didn't feel empowered to speak up on complex problems. Emily's success forced me to re-evaluate those assumptions and make some significant changes to how we operate. He clicked to the next slide, which outlined the restructuring he'd implemented over the past 2 months. I've reorganized the team to be less hierarchical and more collaborative. We've instituted cross-level code reviews where junior developers critique senior work and vice versa. We've created more space in meetings for everyone to contribute, not just the loudest voices or most senior people. And we've promoted based on demonstrated capability rather than time served. Including promoting this Emily Rodriguez, Sarah asked. Yes, she's now the lead systems analyst on Pacific Northwest Medical, our largest incoming project. Which brings me to that update. Marcus spent the next 20 minutes walking through the medical project, explaining Emily's modular approach and the enthusiastic response from the client. He showed projected revenue, timeline estimates, and risk assessments, all significantly better than the traditional approach would have yielded. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Sarah leaned back in her chair and smiled, something she didn't do often in these meetings. Marcus, I'll be honest, 6 months ago, I was concerned about your leadership. The Barrington situation was a mess, team morale was low, and you seemed to be trying to solve every problem yourself, rather than leveraging your people. But this, she gestured to the presentation, this is what I've been hoping to see, not just project success, but actual leadership growth, recognizing your blind spots and actively working to address them. That's rare. Thank you, Marcus said, feeling an unexpected warmth in his chest. I can't take all the credit. My team pushed me to be better. The best teams do that, the COO observed. Question. This Emily Rodriguez. Is there a retention risk? If she's this talented, other companies will notice. Marcus had actually been thinking about this a lot lately. There's always a risk with top talent, but I'm working on making sure she has opportunities to grow here, challenging projects and recognition for her contributions. Actually, I wanted to discuss something related to that. He pulled up a new slide he'd added just that morning. I'd like to propose creating a formal mentorship program in the IT department, pairing senior and junior staff not in a traditional hierarchy, but as mutual learning partners. I'd also like to establish a quarterly innovation award that recognizes outstanding problem-solving, regardless of the team member's level or tenure. Both initiatives would help us retain people like Emily, while also developing our entire team more effectively. Sarah nodded approvingly. Put together a detailed proposal and budget. I like where your head's at with this. The meeting continued for another hour, covering other departments and strategic initiatives. But Marcus felt a shift in how the other executives treated him. There was more respect, more engagement, more genuine interest in his perspective. When the meeting finally ended, Sarah asked Marcus to stay back for a moment. "Off the record," she said once they were alone, "what really happened with you? The change is pretty dramatic." Marcus considered how to answer. "I think I'd been coasting on my technical skills and my early success. I was a good individual contributor who got promoted to leadership, but I never really made the transition from being the smartest person doing the work to being the person who empowers others to do great work. Emily forced me to confront that. And once I did, I realized I had to change everything about how I approached my role. That kind of self-awareness is valuable," Sarah said. "Don't lose it. And Marcus? Make sure Emily knows we value what she brings to this company. People like her don't come along often. If we're smart, we'll build her career here, not watch her take those talents somewhere else." "Understood. I'm on it." Marcus returned to his floor, feeling energized. The office was buzzing with its usual afternoon activity. Developers hunched over keyboards, impromptu whiteboard sessions in the collaboration spaces, the steady hum of productivity and problem-solving. He spotted Emily at her desk, deep in conversation with Derek and Jennifer about database architecture for one of the medical system modules. The three of them were laughing about something, and Marcus felt a surge of pride watching them work together. Derek, who'd been skeptical of Emily at first, now sought out her input on virtually every major decision. Marcus waited until their discussion wrapped up, then approached Emily's desk. "Got a minute?" he asked. "Sure. What's up? Walk with me?" They headed to the break room, which was empty at this hour. Marcus poured them both coffee from the always-available pot. Terrible office coffee, but better than nothing. "I just came from the quarterly executive review," he said, leaning against the counter. "Presented on Barrington, on Pacific Northwest Medical, on the team restructuring." "How'd it go?" Emily asked, doctoring her coffee with an alarming amount of sugar. "Really well." Sarah was impressed. "But more importantly, I made sure they know who really turned things around with Barrington. Your name is on record at the executive level now. They know what you did." Emily looked surprised. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did. Because it's the truth, and because you deserve the recognition, but also because I want to make sure you have visibility in this company beyond just our department." Sarah specifically asked about retention, whether we're at risk of losing you to another company. "I'm not looking to leave," Emily said quickly. "I know, but you should have options. And that means people at the top need to know your name and your capabilities. So I want to propose something. I'm putting together a mentorship program, and I'd like you to be one of the founding participants, not as a mentee, though you'd benefit from having a senior mentor, but also as a mentor yourself for some of our newer hires coming in next quarter." Emily nearly choked on her coffee. "Me? Mentor? Marcus, I've been here less than 2 months, and you've already demonstrated that you can see problems others miss and develop innovative solutions. That's exactly the kind of thinking we need to cultivate in new team members. Look, I'm not suggesting you teach people how to code or explain enterprise architecture, but you can teach them how to ask better questions, how to dig into legacy systems, how to challenge assumptions. Those skills are rare, and you have them." Emily was quiet for a moment, considering. "I guess I could try. But what if I'm not good at it?" "Then you'll learn and get better, just like you've done with everything else here. Emily, I need you to understand something. You're not just good at this job, you're exceptional. And yes, part of that is raw talent, but a bigger part is your approach, your willingness to dig deeper, to question established patterns, to not accept "this is how we've always done it" as a sufficient answer. That mindset is what transformed our team. I want to make sure we're cultivating it in others. "Okay," Emily said, a smile spreading across her face. "I'll do it. But can I ask you something?" "Anything." "What changed in you? I mean, I'm grateful and everything, but you went from basically telling me to sit down and be quiet to advocating for me at the executive level. That's a pretty significant shift." Marcus set down his coffee cup and thought carefully about his answer. Honestly, I had to confront some ugly truths about myself. I realized I'd been judging people based on superficial criteria, age, experience, how much they matched my mental image of what a talented engineer looks like. And when you proved me wrong so definitively, I had two choices: defend my ego and find ways to diminish your achievement, or accept that my approach was flawed and commit to doing better. I'm glad you chose the second option, Emily said quietly. Me too. But I'll be honest, it wasn't immediate. I spent weeks making excuses in my head, trying to preserve my self-image as a good leader who didn't have biases. It took me longer than it should have to really accept that I needed to change. And I'm still working on it. I still catch myself making assumptions, still have to actively check my first reactions to people and ideas. That's more self-awareness than most people ever develop, Emily observed. Maybe, but it shouldn't have taken a crisis and a near failure of a major project to get here. That's on me. He picked up his coffee again. Anyway, enough heavy conversation. I actually came down here to tell you something else. The innovation awards I mentioned in the executive meeting, I'm backdating the first one. You're getting it for the Barrington solution. It comes with a bonus and a company-wide recognition. Award ceremony is next month. Emily's eyes widened. Marcus, that's too much. I was just doing my job. No, you were doing exceptional work that saved this company's relationship with a major client and probably several people's jobs, mine included. Take the recognition. You earned it. Over the next few weeks, the changes Marcus had implemented began to show results beyond just individual projects. The mentorship program launched with Emily and 5 other team members as founding mentors. The Innovation Awards generated enthusiastic competition, with team members actively seeking out problems to solve and improvements to implement. But more than any specific program or initiative, the culture had shifted. People spoke up more in meetings. Junior developers weren't afraid to challenge senior architects. Mistakes were treated as learning opportunities rather than failures to be hidden. The team felt more like a collaborative unit and less like a hierarchy. Marcus watched it all with a mix of pride and ongoing humility. He'd been so certain he knew how to run a team, so confident in his own abilities and judgment. It had taken Emily's breakthrough and his willingness to really examine his own behavior to show him how much he'd been getting wrong. The award ceremony in early December was held in the building's main atrium, with the entire company invited. Sarah Brennan presented the awards herself, calling each recipient to the front to explain their innovation and receive recognition. When Emily's turn came, Sarah spent extra time on her presentation, walking through the Barrington crisis and how Emily's analysis had solved it. "This is the kind of thinking we value at Meridian," Sarah told the assembled employees. "The willingness to dig deeper, to question assumptions, to persist when others say a problem is unsolvable. Emily Rodriguez has been with us less than 3 months, but she's already demonstrated what's impossible when we hire for talent and potential rather than just experience. Emily, please come up here." Emily walked to the front, looking nervous but also proud. The applause was genuine and enthusiastic. Her reputation had spread beyond just the IT department. Marcus watched from the audience, clapping along with everyone else. Next to him, Derek leaned over and said, "Best hire we ever made, and we almost wasted her on basic testing and documentation." "Yeah," Marcus agreed quietly. "We almost did." After the ceremony, there was a reception with food and drinks. Marcus found himself surrounded by people wanting to discuss the team's success, the new programs he'd implemented, his thoughts on various technical challenges. He answered questions and made connections, but his attention kept drifting to Emily, who was deep in conversation with several other young engineers, clearly explaining something technical with animated gestures. Eventually, the crowd thinned, and Marcus found a moment to pull Emily aside. "How does it feel," he asked, "being officially recognized as the person who saved the day?" "Weird," Emily admitted. Good weird, but still weird. I keep thinking about how I almost didn't speak up. How close I came to just keeping my head down and sticking to assigned tasks because that's what seemed safe. What made you decide to speak up? Honestly, I figured the worst that could happen was you'd tell me I was wrong. And I'd rather be wrong and trying than right and silent. I didn't come here to be invisible. I came here to solve problems. I'm really glad you did, Marcus said sincerely. And I'm sorry it took me so long to appreciate that. You got there eventually. That counts for something. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the last few people filter out of the atrium. So what's next? Emily asked. For the team, I mean. Well, we've got Pacific Northwest Medical through next year. There's a potential contract with a regional school district for their IT infrastructure. And I'm in talks with Sarah about expanding the department, hiring more people like you who can bring fresh perspectives and strong analytical skills. Sounds like we'll be busy. Definitely. But good busy, productive busy. The kind of busy where we're building something meaningful instead of just scrambling to avoid disaster. He paused. Emily, I want you to know, whatever you want your career to look like, we'll make it happen here. If you want to go deep technical, become an architect, we'll support that. If you want to move into leadership, we'll develop you for that. If you want to specialize in a particular area or branch out into different technologies, we'll create opportunities. You've proven yourself, and I want to make sure you have every reason to stay and grow here. I appreciate that, Marcus. Really. Right now, I'm just excited to keep learning and solving interesting problems. The rest, I figure I'll figure out as I go. That's fair. Just know the door's open. As the reception finally wound down and people headed home, Marcus found himself alone in the atrium, looking out at the Seattle skyline. The city lights were coming on as dusk settled over the Puget Sound. It was beautiful in a way he hadn't really noticed before, or maybe he'd just been too stressed and self-absorbed to pay attention. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother, who he hadn't talked to in weeks. Saw the company newsletter. About your team's awards. Proud of you, honey. Call me when you have time. He smiled and typed back, We'll call this weekend. Love you. Another text came through, this one from Derek. Good job today, boss. Team's in a good place. Drinks next week to celebrate? Marcus replied, Definitely. My treat. As he rode the elevator down to the parking garage, Marcus thought about the journey of the past few months. He'd started September thinking he was a good leader, who had everything figured out. He'd ended December knowing he'd been wrong about a lot of things, but finally on the right path. Emily had been the catalyst, but the change had to come from him. She'd shown him what he was missing, but he'd had to do the hard work of acknowledging it, accepting it, and fundamentally shifting his approach. It wasn't comfortable, growth never was. But standing here now, seeing his team thriving, seeing people like Emily getting the recognition and opportunities they deserved, seeing himself becoming the kind of leader he'd always wanted to be, it was worth every uncomfortable moment of self-examination. His car was one of the last ones in the garage. As he unlocked it and climbed in, he thought about where he'd be if Emily hadn't spoken up about the Barrington data, if she'd taken his dismissal to heart and stuck to basic tasks, if she'd decided that this wasn't the right environment for her and left after that first week. They'd probably still be struggling with the migration. The Pacific Northwest medical contract might have gone to a competitor. His career might be in a very different place. But more than any of that, he'd still be operating under the assumptions and biases that had been limiting him and his team. He'd still be the person who told talented people to step aside instead of listening to what they had to offer. He'd told her to step aside, and then he'd watched her solve what they'd missed for months. And in solving that problem, she'd revealed a much bigger one. The problem with how he led, how he evaluated people, how he thought about talent and contribution. Fixing that problem was going to be ongoing work, but at least now he knew it existed. At least now he was trying. Marcus started his car and headed out into the December evening, the rain starting again, washing the streets clean. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new problems to solve, new opportunities to do better. But for tonight, he let himself feel something he hadn't felt in a long time, genuine pride. Not in his own accomplishments, but in his team's success. Not in being the smartest person in the room, but in building a room full of smart people who could challenge and learn from each other. That, he was finally beginning to understand, was what leadership actually looked like. And it all started the moment he stopped telling people to step aside and started listening to what they had to say. The end.